Hello, this is Leilani with Indigenous Led. I am the story producer of the Indigenous Led podcast. Today we have Stephanie Barron. She is the conservation science lead and ecologist for Indigenous Led. She has worked in the fields of botany, forestry, fisheries, wildlife, and environmental education. She graduated with a master's in environmental science degree and natural resources conflict resolution certificate with the University of Montana. Stephanie's research include traditional ecological knowledge, human-carnivore conflict prevention, community-based conservation, and decolonial curricula development. Engaging communities and shifting perspectives of Keystone relatives is what she is most passionate about. Welcome, Stephanie. Would you like to add a little bit more about who you are and when you came on board with Indigenous Led?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Leilani. I'm really excited to be here. Like Leilani said, I'm Stephanie Barron. I was born in Michigan to my German-American mother and my Indigenous and Mexican father. I'm Chiricahua Apache and Indigenous Mexican, and I've lived all over the U.S., moving around with my parents as they pursued their career goals. Moved to Montana a little over 6 years ago from Northern California, where I did a lot of my wildlife and fisheries work because I wanted 4 seasons. You don't really get that out in the temperate rainforests of Northern California. So moved out here so I could get some seasonal diversity and also be closer to species that have always resonated most deeply with me, which are carnivore species. I live in Missoula, Montana, which is the traditional homelands of the Bitterroot Salish and Kalispé people. Yeah, have my own little carnivore, Ziggy Starcat.
I've seen his picture when your phone number came up on my phone today.
Yeah.
I think he was the main one.
Yeah, that's my cat.
That's awesome. So Stephanie, can you talk to us and tell us about how you got into the work of Indigenous conservation?
Yeah, I think my journey to focusing on an Indigenous approach to conservation came from all of my work within Western conservation. Pretty much my entire career up until graduate school had been in working within a Western framework of conservation. But since I was a child, I have been obsessed with cats specifically, but I've always wanted to work outside with animals and with nature, despite growing up in a city, in an urban place where I really didn't have access to nature. Child of the 90s. So I would sit and watch just tons of Animal Planet and tons of National Geographic and was just constantly amazed. And so throughout childhood into undergrad, I focused on conservation and on wildlife biology. What really cued me into community-based conservation was actually a trip to Tanzania and Africa that I took while in an undergrad. And it was a month-long program. What really stood out is we were meeting with Burunge Wildlife Management Area elders. And in Africa, they have just abundant mega carnivores and mega fauna. They were asking us as youth, what should we do? What do you recommend we do? And I remember feeling so disturbed by that question. Why are these elders asking us? Like, they know. The people who live here know best how to live with the animals around them and with the land around them. And so after that, I really began focusing on community-based conservation. And then as I worked for federal and state and nonprofit organizations after that, I started being like, okay, this is like more than just community-based conservation that we need. Really, the solutions for the future lie in all of the technologies and wisdom of the past. And working in the Western paradigm of conservation, as an Indigenous person, continually felt some level of dissonance in that space because there was no recognition of the spiritual. There was no recognition of animals as being whole independent beings themselves. Like often they were just numbers and just data, pieces of an ecosystem that rarely were acknowledged as beings that cooperated together and that we were a part of that system too. I think that's the long answer to how I got here.
That is really interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about an Indigenous person working in conservation. But one of the things that they had said, and it really shifted my thoughts and mindset, and this was a number of years ago, they said that how we look at natural resources, but we as Indigenous people didn't have that word. We look at it as resources.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we look at the Western paradigms and the history of the idea of preservation and conservation, these are models of land management that are born either through an assumption that whenever people engage with the land, that they will do harm to the land. That is how the preservation model was founded, like with John Muir. Or you have Gifford Pinchot, who founded the conservation model in the United States. The whole premise of his conservation model was to ensure that there was an economically viable product that could continue to be sustained from the land. So it had nothing to do about sustaining ourselves, sustaining the land itself. It purely had to do with sustaining economic value. As I learned more about and worked within the Western paradigm, this is not the relationship that I have with the land. And this is not the relationship with the land that the people who I see having the most impact and doing the most good have with the land. This is a relationship of commodification, a relationship of fear about human interaction with the land and that separation of humans and land.
About your journey into the family of Indigenous led, and then also before that, maybe talk about the understanding of that shift when you were studying, and then when this is so important for traditional ecological knowledge be utilized within our conservation space.
So much of my knowledge has come from the guidance of Indigenous mentors that I was able to have at the University of Montana, specifically Dr. Rosalind Lapierre, who's Blackfeet. Without her help, I wouldn't have been able to get into grad school. Once I was in grad school with Roz as my primary mentor, it was just this stream of knowledge transfer. Okay, here's this resource, here's this other Indigenous scholar and this Indigenous scholar. And this really speaks to like the power of Indigenous mentorship. That was what she was filling my to-do list with, and like my reading list with, was Indigenous scholars, more Indigenous just people like writing and sharing their stories, telling their stories. Dr. Rosalind Lapierre, Jennifer Harrington, Dr. Gianna Doan-Kreider, Janine Lichtenberg, all of these women specifically really guided my academic and shaped my academic trajectory. And I think through that exposure, I was able to find a type of conservation that finally resonated. Luckily, I also met someone who was able to introduce me to Christina, who's the executive director of Indigenous Led. And from there, it's history.
That is awesome. So how long have you been with Indigenous Led?
Yeah, it's been about 9 months.
9 months. That's really infant. Since you've been on board, how has that been going? And what are some of the projects and work and the importance of it?
Since I was brought on, I think some of the most important work is working on our Braided Science plan. The key of that is in the name of the program itself, Braided Science, and strategically thinking about, as Indigenous Led builds its science program, how are we going to bring these knowledge systems together in ways that prioritize Indigenous knowledge and relationships to the land? Instead of finding Indigenous science that complements Western science, how are we finding Western science that complements Indigenous science? Recognizing that both knowledge systems have their unique strengths, but acknowledging and prioritizing Indigenous science and ways of knowing, doing, and being.
So I know the purpose behind the Braided Science program is to build the case for Indigenous-led conservation by supporting and amplifying Indigenous scientists and Indigenous-led conservation models. Can you speak to the difference, even if it's in a nutshell, Indigenous-led conservation models as opposed to Western conservation models? What are the differences?
Within most Western conservation models, we are looking primarily at quantitative data to help understand the world. Within Indigenous-led conservation models, we are looking at qualitative data. That is song, that is story, that is history, and that is ceremony, that is spirituality, that is the mystery. Even under that list, there are things that Western ideas of even qualitative data don't encapsulate. When we think about an Indigenous-led model of conservation, we are thinking about a much more holistic approach to conservation rather than a purely quantitative approach.
I know there's a shift happening in the past number of years of looking more towards tech or traditional ecological knowledge, which has now been coined Indigenous-led conservation. Why is this so important that it is now this sort of braided science?
Yeah, for me, I see braided science as a pathway to Indigenous-led science. As we wean ourselves off of the Western paradigm, we can braid these knowledge systems so that future scientific endeavors and scientific approaches are just inherently Indigenous science. So I see that pathway in the future, and I think the times that we are living in, a time of immense climatic changes, an increase in natural disasters, in drought, wildland fire, in conflict amongst people, and hypercommodification of the land that sustains all living beings and non-living beings, I think demands that we move away from a science that is largely based in commodification and in the sustaining of economies and more into a science that nurtures relationship and nurtures the sustaining of ourselves as humans as a part of a larger ecosystem that is reciprocal.
I found this really interesting blog that you wrote, The Stories to Perceptions, Understanding the Root of Negative Narratives Around Carnivores. So I thought it was really interesting. There's some things that I've been doing in my life and our way of knowing the natural world through our stories, through our language. Something really stood out to me, how you brought that out about just the narrative that formed our way of thinking, including my own as a child with Goldilocks and the bears and just all these nursery stories of the carnivores within our life.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
By the hair on your chinny chin chin, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
And then you look at our Indigenous stories and how they are relatives to us and how they have taught us so much. And they are in relationship really with us. But these narratives have surrounded us within this country with something negative. So I would love to hear you talk about this blog and bring us into that world of understanding.
Yeah, always happy to talk about carnivores. But the stories that we are told and the way that we are told stories and the way that stories are shared and research shows fundamentally shapes how we understand, interact with, and engage with the world. So you mentioned the Goldilocks and Three Bears story. That nursery rhyme is told, and often the three bears are painted as the villains in that story. When I gave this presentation recently at the World Wilderness Congress, I told a different story. One about a girl who breaks into the bears' homes, who steals and eats their food, who breaks the baby bear's chair, and then who rumples up everyone's bed trying to find the one that's just right. And when we look at it that way, and then the bears come home angry and scared themselves because someone has broken into their house. What would your reaction be if you came home with your child and your food was disrupted, the door was open, there was like a mess in your house that you didn't leave. I think Goldilocks is the villain in that story. She's the one who broke into their place, and those bears' reaction was very reasonable. But that's not the way that story is told. And I think a lot of the nursery rhyme stories that we have around carnivores very often paint those animals as villains. And then even in broader society, as we move into adulthood, carnivores are still very often painted as villains or as nuisances. We never really reflect on our own actions as humans in the ways that we engage with the world. I think that opportunity for reflection is often missed when we hear stories about a grizzly bear who comes on ranchers' property and eats a calf or something. We never think about how much land that ranch took away from the bear and how difficult it is for the bear to move from one area to another to gain the food and sustenance that they need. Or like the stories we hear about mountain lion, where a hiker or biker comes across them on the trail and they're stalked. And so often it's because that person was getting very close to a kill site where that animal's food was, hard-earned food was, or their kits. So if we were to put ourselves in these animals' shoes or paws, we wouldn't be casting these beings as villains nearly as much as we do. And something that Dr. Lapierre taught me in grad school is to always ask who benefits. So who benefits from narratives around carnivores being villains? When we look at the history of Turtle Island, the so-called United States, we can see a direct parallel in how Indigenous people are portrayed and how large carnivores are portrayed. We can see as Western settlement happened, the rapid decline in Indigenous people and their well-being and the populations of large carnivores, because Indigenous people and large carnivores were the greatest threat to Western settlement and expansion. If settlers wanted to control an area, they needed to get rid of Indigenous people and large carnivores in order to feel safe. And that goes into the larger stories that a lot of Europeans brought with them to this country. And specifically related to large carnivores, when we look at Indigenous stories across Turtle Island, it is very rare that carnivores are painted in an antagonistic or villainous way. Most often, these species are recognized as very powerful, very wise, very sacred. These are like protective beings. When we look back at a lot of creation stories, these are the creatures who first would offer assistance or guidance on how to survive on the land, which again, when we think about this braided knowledge approach, that makes a ton of sense. Humans eat almost exactly what bears can eat. And we have learned a lot in our time on this continent from these carnivorous species on how to hunt effectively. I'm pretty sure Blackfeet would wear wolf skin to guide buffalo to jumps. There was learning that happened there. There wasn't an immediate response of hatred or of fear, but of respect and acknowledgement of another being's innate capabilities and that we could learn from them. I think that just really shows the difference between the kinds of stories that are held by Indigenous people compared to Western settlers and scientists when we look at our relationship with carnivores.
Yeah, that is so true. As you were talking, I was just thinking about how this narrative formed a lot of us in Indigenous communities within my generation. And I have seen the shift and have seen the difference. For instance, I think I'm able to be more aware and intentional when I'm teaching my grandchildren about the relationship that we have with certain animal species that we consider our relatives. When I grew up with the Three Bears and Goldilocks, or the Three Little Pigs, or even the Wizard of Oz, what are some of the things that we can do in the conservation space, but also the educational space of young people? How can we change this within our school systems, within our families, where they're not growing up to respect these carnivore relatives?
Societally, we just have to work on decolonizing ourselves, decolonizing our relationship with the land, decolonizing our pedagogy and the curriculum that we're teaching children and engaging them with. One of the ways I've done that in curricula that I've developed is by playing games where children get to act out as animals, all different kinds of animals, and put themselves in those animals' paws or their hooves or their talons. Really think about, what would my life be like? And what would I do if I came across humans in this situation, or in another situation? What would I feel? And so much of Western pedagogy and curricula, it's very logic-based. Intentionally or not, dichotomies between humans and nature are ingrained into that, as are hierarchies. Humans over nature is the epitome of evolution, like the wisest, the best, the most evolved. These things are all subliminally woven into the way that we are teaching youth. And so if we're to decolonize our relationship with the land, we have to start with the youth and how we are teaching youth to understand the land, not just understanding the water cycle and all of the different parts. That is important, but also understanding all of the beings that rely on water and that participate in that water cycle, like beaver, who hold water on the land and create ecosystems for so many other beings. We have to start creating empathy with the land, and decolonizing curricula has to start from a place of empathy rather than animosity.
So people in leadership roles, what are some of the things that can be done as far as policy making right now to start shifting that, or bring in a different understanding, or even a revelation of this human carnivore relationship?
Two things that come to mind. The first is, in the broader conservation space, this is exactly why Indigenous-led conservation is so needed and so important, because as so many Indigenous communities are healing from intergenerational trauma and the intentional erasure of culture and stories and forced assimilation, as we are healing from that, we have a fantastic opportunity to reclaim our relationship with nature, to remember the stories that existed before the new stories that we were told from settlers or from Western society about what our relationship with nature should be. So when it comes to policymakers like state and federal governments and the land managers that work for those governments, and Western academics as well, is Indigenous people are going to provide the best model for successful conservation in the future, because these are communities and cultures who have existed on their respective landscapes since time immemorial, and that includes at least the last 30,000 years. The solutions, the technologies for our restoration of relationship are held by Indigenous people and by Indigenous communities. Within Indigenous communities, we really do need to acknowledge just what I mentioned, that we are recovering from intergenerational trauma and cultural erasure and forced assimilation, and that for older generations of individuals, they may have been conditioned to only value quantitative science or only expect to have a certain kind of relationship with the land. But these are trained behaviors and trained understandings of the world. And so, it can be really tricky if you're working with tribal elders who have subscribed to like the Western ideologies and understandings of the world. What we do in that situation is we hold empathy. And we remember that this is not their fault or not their choice necessarily, but that this is the world that they were brought up in, the ideologies that they were forced to assume in order to maintain their own safety. So we come from a place of empathy. In all of the work, we have to come from a place of empathy. And then I think when working with older people, you just have to bring kids with you. It's been my experience, and certainly working with carnivores, which can be highly contentious species, you will have people who just will not change their mind. If you have a person of my generation come up to them, they will not be told anything other than what they believe. But if you get a little child to talk to an elder, magic happens, doors open. And again, this is wisdom that Indigenous people have held and valued forever, is that intergenerational learning. And so when we think about decolonizing our relationship with the land, we are decolonizing our communities, we're decolonizing and remembering our intergenerational wisdom, and that this isn't just from elders down to young people, but it's from young people to the elders.
That is such a good point. I know that to be true because I've got grandchildren that are really small, and they bring this understanding even to me when I'm out there and I'm feeling like I'm connecting to the land, and I know all this Indigenous understanding. But when I have them out there, it's a whole deeper understanding and connection. They hold this wisdom that they've always known. And they always say within some of our Indigenous communities that the kids, the little ones, they are sacred. Mm-hmm. They're not messed up with everything that we are as we grow older. And I don't know if it's the Lakota language or what language, but there is a word which, when they speak of the little children, it pretty much translate little sacred or sacred beings or something like that. Holy.
Yeah.
They are holy. Yeah, so that is such a great point of bringing kids with you. And I could just speak of our Sitsuke-Tutapi Blackfoot homelands where we live, is that the DNA speaks. The DNA is true. We may have lost our language a long time ago and we're regaining it back, but that understanding and that connection in our DNA is still there.
Yes.
It's still there. And so I think that is just so important. You just really taught me something. Bring the kids.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
I know that part of the purpose and mission of the Braided Science program, but also the Indigenous-led mission and vision is to create change. Can you speak to maybe one project that you would like to see within your service to this Indigenous-led conservation work?
Grateful that you use the word service too, because that really is what I see my role in Indigenous-led and Indigenous-led as an organization itself is what Indigenous-led does, and what we always are going to be aspiring to do is like, how can we be of service? So whatever Indigenous community we are working with and collaborating with, how can we best be of service to that community? As the kin-centric ecologist, I think too about not just the Indigenous communities that we can be of service to, but the other non-human relatives that we can be of service to. In the future, I'm really looking forward to identifying ways to be of service with beaver, some work that we are thinking about doing with bears. So yay, more carnivores. These are two species, along with the bison relatives that we work with up here in Blackfeet and Blackfoot country, that we're looking forward to working with in the future. We have this beaver video that we're working on, and Leilani, that you're playing an important role in. It's for the general public, so hopefully we get Indigenous and non-Indigenous viewership. But again, that is telling a different story about Beaver. There are factoids in it, like how much the beaver weighs, how long have they been evolving on this continent. There are those factoids, but there's also a whole 2 chapters about Indigenous history with this relative, the beaver, in a way that I think a lot of beaver videos you will not see. So I'm excited about this film that we're working on. That's been an awesome collaboration with the Beaver Institute. And then I'm also getting really excited about some of the mapping projects that we are developing with 3 different tribes in Utah. And that's the Ute Mountain Ute and the Goshute tribes in Utah. And these will be cultural use maps where we'll first look at the historic use of their traditional land, starting with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. Then we're going to identify the places that might be the best and most suitable for buffalo restoration. A restoration of a relative to the landscape is huge because that is going to open all kinds of opportunities for that community to restore their relationship and participate in the responsibilities that they made to buffalo eons ago. So that's big.
Wow, that is really huge. I know it's in its infancy once it starts and happens, and you don't know what you don't know for years to come. But there might be some little changes that you might be able to identify and show and know that something is changing and shifting and happening. That would be really a great episode to come back and talk about. I really appreciate you, Stephanie, coming all this way to talk about your passions and some of the work that is being done, but also just being of service to Indigenous-led conservation and doing what you can and doing what you know and learning as you're going along. And so that's what we're all doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing that I'd reiterate is wisdom that was shared from Dr. Lapierre, my mentor, is always be asking who benefits from the story that you are hearing, from the relationship you have with the land, from the history you've been told or taught. Always ask. I have learned and unlearned so much through the asking of that question in every situation I have been in.
Wow, that wraps it up. We'd like to thank you for tuning in to the Indigenous-led podcast, produced by Leilani Upham with Iron Shield Creative and co-producer Josh Adler with Ecologica. The Indigenous-led podcast would not be possible without the wisdom of our ancestors, our knowledge keepers, and the Myriad supporters who follow our work and invest in our efforts to elevate Indigenous voices and build power so Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing can be directed to the planetary crisis we are living through. Indigenous-led is a fiscally sponsored project of the Wild Foundation, and we dedicate our inaugural podcast to our buffalo relatives, their homelands, and our partners from across Sitsikatsapi. If you'd like to listen to more of the Indigenous-led conversations, please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And follow us on Instagram at Indigenous_LED. And follow our work at indigenousled.org.